Hello, everyone. So, I'm going to talk about the fourth placers today, and after looking at the list of the people who placed fourth in North American Big Brother, a lot of them are pretty poor, so it's definitely an interesting list to do. So, we're getting right to the honorable mentions. So, Justin was in an alliance with Jason, Chrissy, and Danielle, and while that worked for a while, he clearly felt like he was on the outs of that alliance and wanted to be more of a lone wolf. At the same time, he didn't want to play the game and only came for the experience, but was soon over it anyways. From what I remember of Jamie, she was just seen as very calculating, but I think she was one of the few who did see it as a competition and acted accordingly, though not too much to the point where the house and audience caught on and would vote her out. She was a beauty queen, so her behavior in the house made sense, and I also think she went on the show to promote that. So at 32 is Amy. So Amy is one of my favorite BB characters ever, and there has been no one like her that's played damn near 20 years later. But this list is a game players list, and there's no way I can put her high on this. The first reason is that she was evicted in the third week of her season and played relatively poorly during those 3 weeks, as she was not in any of the major alliances and had a poor social game. She was lucky in the fact that there was a returning twist to begin with, and she was able to skip out on 2 weeks of gameplay. When she did return, the house gave her HOH so she could do their dirty work of targeting Roddy and Kiara for them. After that, Amy was a constant pawn for the rest of the season, and there were times where she was looking like she was becoming the target of the week. Amy had no control in the season, was never strategic but emotional, grew socially through the season as people got to know her, but she didn't have the respect as a player and had tremendous luck that would never have been rewarded by the Big Brother 3 cast. At 31 is Cliff. I have Cliff this low mainly for the same reason why Amy is this low. Not only was he evicted before getting fourth place, but he was booted in the third week. You could make the argument that he was evicted with the house knowing about the twist that one of the 4 evictees would come back, but they still proved that he was expendable to the house, and he had 1 in 4 chances of coming back, and wouldn't have minded if he never came back. But he did come back and win HOH immediately, like Amy, and the house used him to do their dirty work in booting Bella. Cliff was kind of left on his own merit throughout the next week, though formed an alliance with Jessica and Catherine during Jessica's HOH, and completely blew that up in the next week. Rich was handled poorly on his end. He was brought into an alliance with Nicole, Jackson, and Holly, which did give him more power in the season, but he made a lot of moves that were against his and Nicole's best interest, and more in Holly and Jackson's favor, especially in the final 6 and the final 5. He often had very poor reads, but thought that he had the right calls and reads, and it always bit him in the butt. Poor strategically, met at best in competitions, had some luck on his side, and essentially had no chance to win, as he also wasn't respected or seen as a threat at all. At 30, I have John. During the season and years later, I never got the big deal about him as a player and a character, but the latter part doesn't really matter here. In the beginning of the season, he would win himself off the block with a competition throughout those weeks. Just from memory, he became close to Shelly and Clay at this time, mainly the latter, out-campaigned for them once they were on the block to be sent home. Of course, he was close to Steve throughout this portion of the season, and Becky was a close ally of his as well. There was a period after the early jury portion of the season where Meg and James weren't being targeted, which caused him to be nominated beside Becky, and he himself would be evicted a week after Becky. So he gets evicted in the final 8, but because of how they formatted the last 2 seasons before this, the house figured out that someone would return. He had a 1 in 4 chance of returning, and was lucky that he did. Him and Steve joined up with Vanessa for a few rounds to take out the Oz twins, and they accomplished that goal with getting 2 of them out, before he's booted in the final 4. He was solid to good socially, poor to meh strategically, was great in competitions, and was a jury threat, but never really had a path to the end, or was great at positioning himself for the endgame. Also, I'm putting people who were evicted before the final 4 dead last. At 29, I have Brittany. I feel like Brittany is a really weird person to talk about. In a lot of ways, she does deserve a lot of what is accused about her, gameplay-wise, but I do feel like there are elements to her game that are underrated. So she starts off the season with not being in the majority alliance whatsoever, and all the girls are essentially forced to attempt a girls' alliance, but it fails on a spectacular fashion. She was pawned during the first few weeks of the season, as some of the girls went home, and then she shockingly won HOH in the third week. I remember her targeting Craig, but refusing to nominate Bruno and Bobby, as she became pretty close to them as the weeks would go on. It is weird since she would still be pawned at times when she would win competitions as well, and served as a shield for Sarah throughout the entire season. Brittany also won the pivotal triple eviction HOH, where she was able to get rid of Kevin, someone who put her in danger on both of his HOHs, and Willow, who was getting close with Sarah, who didn't like her. I also remember her being the person who ended up convincing Bobby to vote out Jordan, which is something no one really talks about, and it shows that she had a better social game than Sarah at certain points of the season. So, of course, it is the final 7, and after Sarah wins the veto, Brittany is being sent to the jury house, but is given the coup d'etat, and she used it to target Bruno because he had issues with Sarah, not her. I feel like she should have targeted Zach here instead. I also think a huge flaw of hers is that she was playing too much for her and Sarah, to the point where she became a shield and burnt bridges with people who liked her more than Sarah, and killed her own agency in the process. Also, she is supposed to be booted in the final 7, which is why she's higher than some of the others, but why she's still very low on this list. At 28, I have Jordan. So, Jordan returns with Jeff, but she doesn't even want to be there, and her sole goal in BB13 is to help Jeff win the season, since she already won. Of course, she aligns with the veterans and are able to get the votes on their side, though she does nothing to get the few newbies on her side. Jordan ends up winning HOH in the second week, and doesn't want to target Cassie and Shelly, mainly the former, because she likes them, and sticks with the choice of nominating Dominic and Adam. They win the veto, and she's pressured into targeting the person that she didn't want to target, when she should have and could have just nominated Kalia and Lawan. For the next several weeks, she remained aligned with Jeff, Rachel, and Brendan, was nominated against Brendan as a pawn in the fourth week, and remained close with Shelly and Adam for most of the season. I don't remember her doing much of anything strategically, and she was even worse socially in this season compared to her last season, as she had actively had a poor relationship with Porsche, didn't care for Kalia, who's begging to work with her, and kind of just stuck with her allies. Of course, there was the final 6, where she's nominated against Rachel, and is saved by the doer's twist. If they kept the same veto competition and was individual, and Rachel still wins, Jordan is an absolute goner here. This week is just a mess overall, so I did dock her a bit here for it. At least in her first season, she had some instinct, but it went out the window here, but it does say quite a bit that she could have been a 2-time winner. She would be a bit high if it wasn't due to all the luck she had in week 8. At 27, I have Sharon, for a lot of the same reasons I have the people below her. I initially had Sharon a lot higher on this list, but I didn't want to be a hypocrite, as she was evicted very early on in the season, which was on day 4, if I remember the exact date correctly, and she was lucky to have come back in the first place, but it was due to a disqualification, and even if that DQ didn't happen, her chances of coming back due to a pre-jury comeback were very low, as the chance was about 12%, as there were 7 other people who were evicted and who would be evicted before the comeback even happened. While it was her partner who caused them to be evicted, everyone knew about the partner's twist, and several others went home due to their partners. When she comes back, Sharon adapts very well and is liked by virtually everyone. The sides of the house starts forming, especially on her and Josh's HOH. So when that tide changed, Sharon spent the rest of the season on the block, outside of the final 9, where James won the HOH. Sharon handles the block well, knows that it's good to hide behind the shadows, and to not bring attention on herself. Sharon was very aware over the season, and self-aware especially, worked on her relationships with everyone on both sides, and almost won the final 4 HOH, but she never got control again and lost her footing due to it. She was a threat to win, and was unlucky with her final H, but I cannot ignore the fact that she was evicted, and the circumstances that happened for her to return to begin with. At 26, I have Well from BB Can 6. Honestly, he is so forgettable now that I'm going back to think about it. I remember Jesse and Derek tried to align with him during the early weeks, and he ended up rejecting it, especially when Jesse was on the block to go home. I thought it was due to a strategic move, but he didn't even think about it from a strategic lens. For a few weeks after that, his social game actively got worse, as he became a lot more volatile, brash, and rude. I remember him freaking the hell out because he got one vote from Ryan when he was on the block for eviction. He wasn't active strategically, and when he was trying to be, it only resulted in causing more confusion within his alliance with Paris and Maddie, and no one else really went to him for anything strategic, since everyone knew he was a complete goof and dead in that element. He didn't win any competitions, didn't really influence anyone, or really have any sort of power throughout the rest of the season. And I also remember him screwing up in the Final 5 veto, where if he won, he could have saved his entire alliance that week. He's higher than the others because he was never spared by any twist or any other contrivances. Dina. I really have nothing to say about Dina Lohan. She was a coaster throughout the entire season, as she was not in any sort of alliance whatsoever, but had decent enough relationships with other people, and was not threatening to anyone, so she stayed around. I say coaster because she never floated between any side, and it wasn't an intentional thing on her part. At 24, I have Kevin. I really do not have much to say about Kevin and his game throughout the season. He had a close relationship with Paul because he thought Paul was cool, and Kevin actually had a solid social game for the first 2/3 of the season. For an older man, he fit in with the cast exceptionally well, and people saw him as the cool uncle that you would want your friends to meet. To be honest, he was just there for a majority of the season, following the majority and doing whatever Paul told him to do. But he then started pissing people off in the cult for one reason or another. He started lying incessantly, and then couldn't get himself out of certain gems, and people lost a lot of respect for him. Kevin never won a single competition in the season, and he was never nominated until the very end, where he was nominated as a pawn during his last 4 rounds. Kevin was nothing spectacular and literally coasted, not even floated, throughout the season. At 23, I have Tala. From what I remember of Tala, she was not in any sort of alliance in the beginning, but she would rat out what she knew to people in power, mainly Jillian and Emmett, which was done early on in the season. She had a solid social game where people thought she was funny and cute, though she even had a fiery moments earlier on in the season. She was somewhat of a floater during this period, due to being non-threatening and not really having any allies, but things would change once she was brought in mid-game to be a part of the East Coast Alliance. Emmett, Jillian, and Andrew never really relied on her for strategic advice, but would give her suggestions and instructions on what they needed to do. Though there were several points where they got fed up with her incompetence, lack of competition wins, and her anger issues that became more prevalent later on in the season. It also does not help that she was nominated for every round from the Topaz boot onto her own boot in the Final 4. Tala was poor strategically, poor competitively, and a mixed bag socially, but the jury did want her to win, though they admitted that it was due to a petty narrative that they were trying to create instead of being part of the game she played. At 22, I have Caleb. Due to winning the very first HOH, Caleb was put in a very good position in the season, and being brought in the Bomb Squad Alliance, which they did turn into the Detonators, made him a key player in the season. When it comes to strategy, Caleb was never the leader in any of the strategy, and it just seemed like his strategy was about winning competitions and going to the end with the Alliance, which is fine. His Alliance also wanted to get rid of him several times throughout the season, but would change their minds because they realize he's easier to manipulate and influence, and will self-destruct later on. A major fault of his was that he has no self-interest, like taking Frankie out on his HOH, when he was the only person who would take him to the end, and following every single instruction without even thinking of anything else, and whether these people had good intentions for him. And Caleb thought he was a bigger, stronger player and a threat than he really was. He was relatively poor socially, weak strategically, not good at positioning himself to win, but was great in competitions. He wasn't even a jury threat. At 21, I have Christmas. Christmas entered the season with not having a target on her back and not having much of a reputation at all. For the first 1 to 2 weeks, she got along virtually well with everyone and got really personal with people, which is how she was in BB19. She gets brought into the majority alliance and starts falling under a lot of the same habits she did in her first season, becoming a lot closer to her male allies than her female allies, to the point where she doesn't get along with the other women, and she plays too much for the team. When she does win HOH in week 5, she handles it very poorly with her attitude. As the season goes on, she gets a bit tunnel vision for a while, but when she decided to vote out Nicole over David in the triple, there was some self-interest that showed to me that maybe there was something more that she was starting to see, and she was starting to get the bigger picture. In her own way, she was, but it was when she became the outcast of the house, and there's no more people in the alliance, and the outer rings of her alliance were gone now. Overall, she falls under most of the same fates that she did on her first season, hence her being here on the ranking. Not good in competitions, blew it socially, didn't need luck, but learned too late about strategy and positionality. Lolo. So, Lolo held a lot of power throughout the season. She had a tight alliance with Natalie, where she also worked with Tamar and Ricky throughout the season. Lolo always had the numbers throughout the season, knew when to take out certain people, and when to leave alliances. She was initially working with Jonathan and Ryan before turning on them, and had a deal with Kato and Tom, which blew up spectacularly. At the same time, Lolo had arguably the worst social game in the entire cast, and it was the stronger players in Natalie and Tamar who had better strategic acumen that helped her exponentially. At 19, I have Brittany. From what I remembered, Brittany was aligned with Monet, and they spent a lot of time talking about the others, while not thinking a whole lot about the game, though knew that she wanted Brendan and Rachel out of the house. So Monet goes very early, and Brittany gets close to Lane, which was a smart move, whether she intended for it to be or not. Throughout this, she became close to Hayden and Matt as well, while forming a close bond with Reagan throughout the season. Brittany was actually very good in competitions, so she had that as an advantage. And the people she hated, mainly Brenchel, went out of their way to try to get her to work with them several times throughout the season, though she rejected it, and I don't know if this was the best idea or not. She became way too focused on Britain after the pre-jury phase, and it caused her to be blinded from everything else that was happening in the game, and was coerced into backdooring Matt on her HOH when she didn't want to do it. She was shocked to find out, she was told, that there was a boys' alliance the entire time, and she had no chance of winning, which she should not have been shocked by. She was pretty solid socially, pretty poor strategically, as she ran on emotions rather than logic a lot of the time, and was very great in competitions, but wasn't a jury threat and had no chance of winning. At 18, I have Heather. In the first half of the season, Heather was playing very poorly, as most of the house did not like her, found her to be incredibly fake, and was actively being targeted by a majority of the house. It was not until Aika's HOH where she was nominated to be sent home, and was lucky that Paul was nominated beside her, since half of the house flipped to boot him instead of doing it to keep her. There is a difference. Rochelle wins the next HOH and is ready to send her home before she's talked into backdooring Aika, which saves Heather again, and that has more to do with the house wanting Aika gone instead of keeping Heather. The Canada's HOH definitely changed her position in the house and her trajectory, since she could have been an easy target or pawn during that week under normal circumstances, and her enemy's alliance was dismantled. She then won the HOH in the next week that ended up sending Sarah home, and was brought into the alliance with John, Neda, and Adele, as well as Arlie. They were a solid alliance and did what they needed to do, with her being a loyal ally, but it became clear that they were going to drag Sabrina to the end, meaning that they would have to target one another sooner than later. Heather was John's target in the final 5, but she won the veto, though he would ultimately boot her in the final 4. She played alright, but I don't think she was a huge jury threat and had the respect there that would warrant a win. And while she did improve as a player in the end and had more self-awareness, I think a lot of her early game just hindered her a bit too much. At 17, I have Angela. Alright. What I remembered about Angela is that there were a lot of people in the house that did not like her from the start, and I guess it was just a vibe of hers that just rubbed people the wrong way. She was a part of the level 6 alliance with Brett, Casey, Rachel, Tyler, and Winston, and they for the most part didn't have any power outside of what Tyler was doing on the side. She was just laying low for the first few weeks, to the point where fans online would call her furniture, but it worked since she was never a target or a pawn for anyone on the Felte's side during this part of the season. So she wins HOH in week 6, and her first instinct and plan is to target Scotty until Tyler tells her to target Bailey due to a power up. The move itself isn't awful, but Bailey was the only person she was close to on that side who was never going after her and could have used Bailey and her power up to her advantage if she really wanted to. So she handles this horribly and runs into her room all week to hide from Bailey, who is honestly rightfully upset. Week 7 happens where she and Casey are nominated, and I think the hacker saves her from going home this week, since Casey won to nominate Rockstar beside them, and even if Tyler was nominated next to Angela, she probably goes, and if it's just her and Casey, I'm pretty sure she gets voted out, since Kyla clearly saw more worth in Casey. The other level 6 people liked Casey more, and Felty were obviously still pissed off at her for what she did to Bailey. At the same time, a lot of this is very, very, very speculative, so you can overlook this if you want to. So Angela, as well as Casey and Tyler, starts winning the next several competition and steamrolls throughout everyone else until JC wins the final 4 HOH, and she is booted because Casey agreed on the final 2 with Tyler. So she did have some decent reads throughout the season, but she let herself be convinced by Tyler to do whatever he wanted, was pretty good in competitions, was awful socially, and doesn't win a jury vote against most people. And the one person that she might beat, like Sam, was never even an option for her, which is a problem in itself. And she most likely needed a twist to save her to get her to the final 4 to begin with. At 16, I have Mcrae. I remember Mcrae being set up very well in the beginning of the season. He won the first HOH and the first veto competition, but no one saw him as a huge threat that needed to be taken out. He made the easy move of nominating house targets and people no one cared about, but knew that working with Alyssa was smarter than not. He had a pretty good social game with most of the house throughout the first few weeks and ended up in the majority alliance that formed throughout those weeks. But as the weeks went on, he becomes more and more isolated with Amanda, and there were times where they would spend all day in bed together, and it doesn't help that he was perceived as being a follower to Amanda and doing her bidding. He actively chose to play a passive game since he did not want to be a huge target and knew it would bring him far, which it did for most of the season. But there were times where his passivity became naivete, and it caused him to be tricked by the exterminators quite a bit during the later portion of this season, which we did see in a second HOH. Mcrae needed to win out from around the final 7 onwards. I think he was the initial target of Gina Marie's HOH, actually. And he went out to the final 4, where he couldn't get it done. Despite being good at competitions and decent strategically as well as socially, he had very little jury respect and found Amanda's campaigning to be obnoxious. They found her campaigning for him to be obnoxious. That's what I meant. Mark. I don't really remember Mark being in any sort of alliance, but I do remember that he was close to James, but he was a better player as he laid under the radar and was just nice to everyone. He won an HOH where he took up Brandy, which was the right move because she was targeting him and James. I don't have anything else to say, really. Ariadna. She was close friends with Brandy and worked with Ross and Marissa throughout the season. She was pretty good socially, but I don't remember her being that strategic at all. I think she won 1 or 2 competitions, and the one HOH that I do remember was used to go after Shannon. But I don't have anything else to say, and I think she was talked into going out of Shannon. Overall, she is a mid-tier player, which is why she is here. At 13, I have Keisha. When you look at Keisha's game from beginning to end, she was essentially always in the majority. She was a part of the majority group who was tired of Brian's crap in the first week, and they made an agreement to target the likes of Steven, Dan, Rennie, and Jerry so they can all get to jury together. Of course this doesn't work, and she forms the Coven Alliance with April and Libra, with Ollie being an affiliate. The issue is, she doesn't like either woman, but they all need one another, so they continue working with one another. Keisha wins HOH in week 3 and targets Angie, who was a part of the other side of the quote-unquote group she was in, so it was a smart move, but she did it for emotional reasons, since she blamed Angie for Steven getting a lot of the blame in the previous week. and because Angie was the closest to Memphis. She decides to flip on April in the following week because she doesn't want to lose Memphis, who was the target that week, but she was also over April in general. She was able to get a majority alliance of Memphis, Libra, Rennie, and Dan that was set up for this vote, and she of course survives the block against Libra in the next week. The four of them took over the rest of the season, and she would win under the HOH. But you could tell that it became clear that Dan and Memphis were running the show, and things were getting out of Keisha's grasp. She was initially shocked that she ended up being booted over Jerry, but she did have the intuition beforehand to realize that it was happening well before it actually happened. In general, I do think she has great instincts and has a lot of strategic potential, but she does things that tend to run on emotions at times, and she's solid socially as a strategist. I don't know how big of a jury threat she actually was, and how much the jury would have actually voted for her, so that's also why she's kind of just here. At 12, I have Erica. Erica definitely struggled for the first few weeks in the house, which she has admitted herself. Dealing with Robert in the house was a lot for her to deal with, and she started isolating herself very early on. People also found her to be very fake and very off, which also made her a very easy target. Luckily for her, she was in the OG alliance, so when she was targeted by G, she had enough votes to stay in the house. At the same time, I don't think she did anything to get them to want her to stay, but it's more so due to the other players deciding to screw over the Scrooges. Erica was actually in a strong trio with Jack and David for the first few weeks, before Dana decided to nominate both of the guys, and David ended up going home. From this point onwards, it was mainly just her and Jack in the alliance, with Nathan kind of being with them, though he did try to float a bit at the end. And the girls, June and Allison, floating. She got the HOH in the final 7 to target Justin, which is the obvious move, but a good one nonetheless. I will say that she did work when she was nominated against Jack and fought to stay in the house. She was able to get June and Allison to agree to an alliance with her, which caused them to make it to the next few votes. I like that she campaigned for herself instead of campaigning against Jack, as many people on the show think that campaigning for themselves means you are campaigning against the other person, which isn't the case. She decides to repair her relationship with Robert and starts working with him too, so she was somewhat floating at the very end. The thing is, Allison and June caught on to her act and boot her. She was a jury fit to win, and probably reaches the final 2 to win if Allison doesn't win that final 4 veto. She was poor socially, but improved as the season went on, was pretty good at the competitions, and grew strategically, while not needing contrivances to survive. At 11, I have Jamika. From what I remember, Jamika was a part of the Majority Alliance throughout the pre-jury phase, and actually had a great social game. She was not used to dealing with so many white people, as she grew up in a predominantly black area, so she had to learn to adapt, which she did well. She would give her opinion on what was happening in the house to her allies, though it became very apparent that she wanted Zach out of the house more than anything else. She ends up winning the veto in the 4th week and decides to play alongside her faith, meaning that whatever is predestined and she is promised to do, she will do, like saving Jen from the block that week. I did not like the fact that she put so much in that veto competition in the 5th week, when she was never going to win and had to suffer for the rest of the season with not being able to play in any of the HOHs until the final 4. Of course, she gets into it with the Donanos after that flip doesn't happen that week, and because of her inability to win HOHs, I do believe this was mainly why she was kept around throughout those next several weeks, and was used as a pawn, since she essentially couldn't retaliate against it. She did lay under the radar, but when she was allowed to play in the Final 4 HOH, she, No, or Zach could beat the Donatos. Jamika was well liked by the cast, had decent reads, and was true to herself, so she had a chance to win, but she was never going to find a way to get to the end, which is why she is here. At 10, I have Michelle. I feel like Michelle represents the quintessential underdog, as she was that from the very beginning to the very end. She was an outsider on her brains team with Ronnie and Shima, causing her to lean more towards the people working with Jeff and Jordan. This causes a blow up between her and Shima, and the people she started working with never really had her back. Michelle was always someone that the house saw as expendable, and would have went home had the Casey backdoor that week fell through. She won the next two vetoes and decided to single-handedly send Ronnie home after he tried to blackmail and threaten her while never appreciating her for the first month of the game. Apparently, Michelle was the next target entering week 6, so the coup definitely did save her from being a target that week, especially since I don't see Jeff and Jordan fighting for her, so it did improve her position. I do have to have that as in consideration, but it might have never even been a problem since she won the next HOH anyways. We all know that Shima's expulsion caused it to end within 48 hours. She was grouped in with Russell, whom she had a bad relationship with due to her lie, so it is impressive that she made up with him and was able to do so. But other than that, she didn't really have any loyalty to anyone else, though she wanted to be loyal to Jeff and Jordan, but they just never seemed to respect her. She won the veto in the final 8, and people knew that she was a good threat due to her underdog story, being great at competitions, could be a strong floater at times when she wanted to, and having solid reads. She isn't hired because she was never able to get the agencies she wanted, and people never really trusted her. At ninth, I have Cassandra. I don't know what her reputation is like nowadays. I remember her being hyped up to the gods during her season and a bit after that, but after her appearance on BB Can 5 and immediately afterwards, people were calling her overrated as heck. Overall, I still think that her BB Can 4 game was very good. She had solid relationships with most of the house, and while she was messy and plotty, most of the people were fine with it and still enjoyed her company. Cassandra was always speaking with everyone, and it proved to be helpful for her when she was targeted by Levita, and most of the house decided that she was worth keeping around. She was close to that floater group, though was also close to the Jerry and the Kelsey group, since she also knew Jared in real life. I think things took a turn once the fake eviction happened, and she and Tim were able to keep Kelsey as a shield and Boot well, who neither one of them liked and saw as a potential goat. So she maintained good relationships with most of the house, but when she ended up winning HOH in the final 7, she decided to go after the biggest threat, Jared, and it caused that side of the house to be really pissed off at her. But she handled it as well as she could. There was also the double, where the brothers agreed to not nominate her if she never vetoed him off the block, but of course she backed out of that and rushed in doing so. She was the target in the final 5, but partially due to her campaigning and also due to Jorel severely effing up, she managed to stay. Her major fault is that she has a tendency to enjoy messiness too much and refuses to study in the endgame, though she was pretty good socially when she wanted to be and was great strategically while being very self-interested. She just didn't have much of a path to win, and even if Harrington miraculously got to the end, I don't know if she would win over him. At 8, I have Shane. Initially, he was a lot higher on my list, like top 3 high. He was actually great socially, and everyone got along with him throughout the season, while wanting to work with him as well. He was brilliant in competitions throughout the entire season, and I remember him winning the first 3 veto competitions of the season. But no one thought that they needed to target or backdoor him. I think he was helped out by Brittany coaching him, but Brittany herself was a relatively weak coach, especially to the others on that team. So I think a lot of it had to do with him just being good. So he was a part of the majority alliance with Danielle, Dan, Brittany, and Ian throughout the season, and they dominated from beginning to end. There were also points where Frank and Boogie wanted to work with him too. Of course, there are a few faults with him. One is that I think he was playing a bit too much for Brittany and her game, and not his own game, when he really should have followed his own instincts more and played his game. I feel like most of the newbies in this season fell under that trap. The biggest reason why I dropped him is that he allowed Danielle to take Dan off the block, meaning he would be on the block in the final 4, where half of the final 4 is a showmance. Why wouldn't Dan take out the one person who would not take him to the final 2 and the biggest threat to win the entire season? Shane was literally one competition away from winning the season if he didn't allow this to happen, and blew it. He was way too naive and lacked instinct for his own good. At 7, I have April. I feel like April as a game player has always been underrated, and I think it's because Mikey overshadows her as a player, and the Salves are the fan favorites. In the beginning of the season, she actually has solid relationships with everyone, and was the person the Salves liked the most out of the Friendship Alliance, so she went out of her way to be good socially with them too. Of course, April was still very loyal to the Friendship Alliance, but her and Jennifer throughout the first half of the season were the most self-interested out of the group, as they did heavily consider booting Yvette during week 5. It says a lot that she was not nominated with Jennifer on Janelle's HOH, as Maggie and Yvette were also nominated instead. April always tried to do damage control with the solves, and you see this with Keisha and Janelle, whether it succeeds or not, though she does not handle Harvey well at all. In the final 7, she decides to go after James, which is something her alliance kept on putting off for weeks at times. And since she knew she had the best relationships with the other solves compared to her allies, and knew that him playing the middle was dangerous for her, as the final 7 was the final time you could backdoor someone, especially during that time and how the veto was set up during that season. She then decided to work with Janelle in the final 4, which I do feel like was smart and showed self-interest on her part, but Yvette obviously won the veto and wasn't having it. If I do have to criticize her, I think she should not have planned to make it to the end, and floated a bit more throughout the season, but not done it in the way James did. She was the second strongest player in the season, in my opinion. At 6, I have Corey. So he's this high because while he's boring as heck and one of my least favorite BB characters, he didn't screw up much at all compared to virtually everyone else that's below him on this list. He was almost booted first, but managed to stay due to the weird setup of the first 2-ish days of that season. He showmans with Nicole because she was the first HOH. He was brought into the majority alliance at this time. I just remember him staying out of the way for the most part, while his allies just overplayed and threw one another under the bus constantly while self-sabotaging themselves. Of course, as the first half went on, he became BFFs with Polly and worked with the guys more than the girls, as he would often give his input while staying out of the fray as well. Things started to change when Polly was targeted and everyone flipped on them during the Zakia boot. He won the HOH and veto to boot Bridget and laid low while Polly sent himself home. He and Nicole agreed to work with Natalie and James in order to get Victor and Paul out of the house, and he was used as a pawn then as well. Him and Nicole agreed to work with Victor and Paul for the next few weeks to get rid of Michelle and Natalie, which did work, and it was expected that Corey would send James home on his second HOH, but he decided to target Paul and Victor instead. Of course, Paul would get his revenge for this and send Corey home in the final 4. Honestly, Corey just represents a milquetoast, young, muscular, conventionally attractive white man who knew he didn't have to do much, knew his privilege, and let everyone else screw up, while being on good terms with virtually everyone, and winning a good competition here and there. He is this high because he didn't make as many mistakes as the others, and didn't benefit from contrived BS, while having a solid chance of winning the season. At number 5 is Aika. Entering BB Can 5, Aika was one of the worst players in Big Brother history, and I am not exaggerating about that. I do think that this benefited her, as most people simply were not threatened by her at all. She was able to form a bond with Dimitri, and ended up saving him from being the first boot, which would become even more important when he would not only win the next HOH, but become the biggest competitor of the season, for the most part. I remember she would always go back and forth about who she wanted to keep between the nominees for the first 4 weeks, and it honestly got very annoying to watch, but she would always go with what Netta and Bruno wanted, which would piss her off, while also annoying her allies off as well. In the 5th week, I believe she wanted Dylan gone, but they wanted Emily gone, and it caused a ripple effect in the Veterans Alliance, to the point that Aika would convince Cindy to backdoor Netta in the double, which was a good move since Netta was planning on going after her. And then after that happened, she was able to make some sort of alliance with Dylan, causing Cindy to get booted instead, and then Bruno in the following week. Dre and William, who had been allies with her for the entire season, wanted to make a big move of getting herself and Dimitri out of the house, but she was able to get them out of the house at the triple, and was able to convince Kevin, the man who nominated her and Dimitri that week, that it was fine for Jackie to be booted over her. Aika was very good strategically, though there was a mix of emotions involved in a lot of her decisions. Whether her being a goat or not has been heavily debated over the years, but the people that she does potentially beat, she doesn't plan on going to the end with, or couldn't win enough competitions to make that end game happen. At 4 is Hardy. Wow, I'm realizing how messy the fourth places list is if he is number 4 on this list. So, in the beginning of the season, everyone essentially liked him since they saw him as the gentlemanly Superman who fights for the good, doesn't want to win, and wants people who are deserving to win. This is perfect for early 2000s reality TV where morals and stuff like that was important and people didn't really have a blueprint yet. All of the girls wanted to flirt with him, and all of the guys wanted to be him, and the few that hated him did because they couldn't be him. Picking up the desperate Nicole as an ally was very smart, and they had very similar motives, and were strong on their own, but became stronger with each other. He does turn on Autumn coldly, which only foreshadows how he will treat the game, but when he wins HOH, he becomes the quote-unquote martyr, as he targets Sharon, who doesn't handle things well at all, but it makes Top agree with him even more. But his social game does start to falter, as he does have a very huge temper. Hardy and Kent have some sort of a power struggle during the next few weeks and the latter's HOH, as Hardy starts to form a relationship with Will, and they form a trio with Nicole, as he was tired of the Top alliance. Even beforehand, he had alliances that didn't involve Nicole, as he was aligned with Krista and Monica, so he was always playing for himself, and this would piss Nicole off a few weeks later. The issue was, he made this known to the house and was seen as a hypocrite as he turned on his allies over Will, started lashing out a lot more, and became a lot more selfish with his decisions, even stuff that didn't involve the game, and became evil. No one could do anything about it though, since him and Nicole won 3 consecutive HOHs and had Will as an ally, and the others were their pawns. But he made himself a target to the point that Will booted him over Nicole in the final 4. So he was great in competitions, pretty good strategically for the most part, knew when to make alliances and turn on people, but his great social game initially took a tumble as the season went on. He didn't own up to things as much as he should have, and his only potential win was against Nicole, which he knew, while he would lose to anyone else. At 3, I have Nokomis. I think for the cast she had in that season, she played very well. Due to her and Jace not getting along at all and being 2 completely different people, he nominated her for eviction in the first week. She spent this time relaxing and building bonds with people in the house, despite her antisocial behavior. Due to this, she is able to gain solid allies like Diane, Karen, Will, and Adria on her side. When she is nominated against, the entire house, even people like Marvin and Loki Drew, unanimously agree that she would stay in the house against Holly due to the connections she built. And this was even before the veto was played. She ultimately won that veto anyway, so it didn't matter. Diane and herself won the next 2 HOHs and were able to put people on their side into power and to get rid of their enemies like Scott and Jace. I will give Nokomis credit for executing the backdoor brilliantly. I cannot give her credit for coming up with it, but she still had a lot of guts to pull it off. Andrea and Natalie did turn on her alliance, though they were planning on fighting the twins soon anyways, and Nokomis would win the next HOH to split the twins up, which the entire house respected and appreciated. I do feel like after the twins left though that she started to lose ground in the game, as Diane and Drew started outplaying her, and nominating her brother Cowboy was not great in my opinion. The situation put her in a very hard position, but she should have utilized Cowboy a bit more to advantage strategically throughout the season, so that is a fault of hers. Of course, there was the final 5, where they were able to get her closest ally Karen sent home on her HOH by giving Diane the veto win, and Diane not being nominated at the time. And then she was not able to get Cowboy to save her over Diane when it was in his best interest to do so. Nokomis was good socially, good strategically, and was a jury threat, but was not adaptable and lost some gas at the end. At number 2 is Adam. So in pre-game interviews, Adam made it clear that he wanted to start an all-guys alliance and run it like the Brigade did in BB12 to the end, and he accomplished that exactly to the bone. Adam won the first HOH and was able to form the Pretty Boys with Mark, Dane, and Anthony. During his HOH, he got into a showmance with Samantha and caused his alliance to put him at the bottom of the alliance, ironically, as they planned to boot her immediately, like on Dane's HOH in the very next week. But Adam wins the veto and doesn't use it, preventing her getting backdoored. He was also close with Chelsea and Cairo during this time, and I think him having them as allies made Anthony and Dane a bit jealous, so the latter targeted Chelsea on his next HOH in week 4. You would see this go on for the next several weeks, where the girls he is aligned with want to target his allies, or the allies of his allies. He vehemently tells them not to, but when anyone in the Pretty Boys would target his woman allies, he would defend them. He would defend them, but not to the vehement level that he should have in comparison to the Pretty Boys. And if they stayed around a bit longer, Adam could have used them and had more control individually in the game, but I think he cared more about the reputation of the Pretty Boys being this legendary alliance more than winning. Chelsea and Samantha are gone by the time week 7 comes around. Adam has a twist where he nominates Corey post-veto to get his revenge on her and Anthony for targeting Samantha in the previous week, which was a good move, though there was definitely some emotional elements on his end as well. So he wins another HOH, gets rid of Estefania, has to win the final 5 veto to avoid being sent home, and is booted in the final 4 over Kyra. So he is brilliant at competitions, grew to be great socially, was one of the big threats to win, and was solid to get strategically. But I think he was too willfully naive for his own good at times, and I think he cared more about the reputation of his alliance than winning. At number 1, I have Will. There was no doubt that Will was going to be number 1 out of the first placers from the very beginning, especially when you look into how heavily flawed these first placers are generally. Of course, he pre-gamed with the cast, since everyone in an All-Star season generally pre-games, and told production that he would not play without Boogie being there, so he already had an advantage. He played up the fact that he was such a huge target, especially since he was the only winner on the season, but no one was really targeting him that much, and would play into Season 6's egos, especially for the first month of the season, as Season 6 targeted Season 5. He had pre-gamed with Janelle, James, Erica, Howie, Danielle, and a bunch of others, and some of those connections he didn't even use instantly. He would fan the flames against the Season 6 lines to everyone, and would form the Legion of Doom with Boogie, James, and Danielle, which would help as he took some agency from Season 6 and got rid of the one floater that was targeting him in Marcellus. Will never needed to win a competition in the entire season, and unlike in BB2, he threw every competition from beginning to end. As I already discussed how I don't believe he threw every competition in BB2, but he did in BB7. Since many people always leave people alone who don't win competitions. Of course, he gets Janelle to make many poor decisions that are not in her best interest, but are in his best interest. And it was him, not Boogie, that convinced Erica to boot Danielle in the final 6, when it should have been Will on the block. If it wasn't for him bringing his finger in the final 5 veto, he wins that competition, Erica goes home, and he most likely wins the season. Him and Boogie got too comfortable in the final 4, and crossed the line too much emotionally with Janelle, to the point that the lines were blurred, and it led into her booting him. Essentially, he beats anyone if he makes it to the end, and he really played a more dominant game this time around. So that's my list of the 4th placers. It's a mess, as the 4th placers are a mess. I doubt I'm going to talk about the 5th placers because that's just too far down the list for me. So, thank you